Hi, I'm Murray. I am one of the health improvement coordinators in Waverley Care's Gay and Bisexual Men's Project. I think World AIDS Day is a really useful opportunity to kind of get people thinking about HIV and get people talking about HIV. It's a topic that's kind of, if you're not involved in this work or you're not directly affected by it, it's an issue that can maybe pass you by. So World AIDS Day is an opportunity to get HIV into the media, into the public consciousness, and get people having those conversations about it. To me, it is that kind of opportunity to really focus minds. It's about kind of all the different things that World AIDS Day represents. So I think it's a chance for us to say we have a real opportunity here to end new HIV transmission, which would be an incredible thing to achieve. But it's also a chance to kind of reflect on the ongoing issues that affect people who are living with HIV, like to think about the stigma that impacts on their day-to-day lives, and the need to ensure that when we're focusing on ending HIV transmission, we're also making sure that people living with HIV are able to live with dignity and respect, and they're not kind of discriminated against because of their HIV status. So for World AIDS Day this year, we'll be doing a few different things in my project. So I'll be doing a testing clinic. So I'll be offering HIV testing in central Edinburgh, which will be really good fun. Get lots of people along, help people to know their status. I'll also be along at St John's Hospital through in Livingston, where I'll have a Waverley Care stall. So looking forward to having some really good conversations with people, chatting to them about HIV, what it means to have HIV in Scotland in 2023, and to talk about things like getting to zero and challenging stigma. Depending where you are in the world, World AIDS Day can have lots of different meanings and lots of different, and it's important for lots of different reasons. From a kind of global perspective, there's still parts of the world where HIV is a massive problem, where people are dying, and World AIDS Day is a chance to kind of really focus minds and focus kind of energies on work to support people in parts of the world where that's still the case. Here in Scotland, we're fortunate to be in a slightly in a slightly later stage of our journey in terms of tackling HIV. So I suppose World AIDS Day in Scotland is as much about getting that message out there, challenging misinformation, challenging stigma, making people know, letting people know the truth about HIV, while also kind of challenging the discrimination that people living with HIV face, and also for a lot of people an opportunity to reflect and remember people who lost their lives to HIV in the early years of the HIV epidemic. I think stigma is the kind of beginning and end of the work that we need to do to kind of really make a difference around HIV in Scotland. I mean, the stigma has so many broad-ranging impacts. So for people living with HIV, that kind of daily grind of knowing that they're living with this long-term condition that's heavily stigmatized, it makes it difficult for them to talk about with people, whether that's their family and friends, whether that's speaking to people in their work, whether that's talking to doctors or whoever. Knowing that the condition is stigmatized makes it difficult for them to talk. So they'll internalize a lot of that, and they'll experience kind of that can have really damaging implications for things like their mental health, and it can really leave them feeling isolated in their communities. So stigma has that massive impact on people living with HIV. At the same time, when people think about HIV, they still think about the history of HIV. One of the things that we'll hear when we're talking to people is they'll remember things like the Tombstone advert. They'll remember kind of big stories in the media. They'll remember like the treatment of people, of celebrities from back in the day, like Freddie Mercury. And they remember HIV as this terrifying thing that was an unknown and was killing lots of people at that time. They don't know the kind of change that has happened in terms of treatment and what that means for people. So because they only remember the old information, it makes them scared of HIV. It means that HIV remains something that people feel scared of, which shouldn't be the case. And when people are scared, they're not going to think about things like going to get a test, which should be really easy. The fact is that if you're diagnosed with HIV today, you can start treatment, which is going to manage the condition, help you live a long, healthy life, stop you from passing it on. You'll be able to live your life healthily and happily, and people need to know that message, but stigma stops them from taking that first step by getting tested. Working for Waverley Care, I think the thing that really inspires me is the people that are around me every day. So I work with some great colleagues who've come from all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences. They've all had their own reasons for getting into this work, but they all have they all have these kind of unique motivations that really drive them, and I see the work that they're doing, and it's amazing. I then look at the interactions I have and speaking to some of our service users and hearing their stories and all the resilience they have to show to look after their health and well-being, and the challenges that they've overcome, and I find that really inspiring. And then I look at kind of the other people involved, so volunteers and peer supporters who have come to Waverley Care from, again, a whole range of different backgrounds and have their own stories, and they bring that drive and that passion and that determination to the way that they support Waverley Care, and I find that all incredibly inspiring. A concern I would have is, I suppose, we are in a position now, Scotland finds itself in a really interesting position with HIV. We are seeing new infections coming down. We are rolling out PrEP and making it available to lots of people. We have this kind of buy-in with this idea of getting to zero and ending new HIV transmission in Scotland. And that is all fantastic, but there are two aspects of it that I find just not concerns maybe too strong. I just want to make sure, I think it's just something that people need to bear in mind. Firstly, the only way we're going to end new transmissions is if we invest in it. We want to make sure that if we want to make this happen, it's not enough just to say it'll happen. We need to actually invest in it and make it happen. The other thing that I want to make sure is that people living with HIV are part of that story as well. When some people think about getting to zero, it's like eliminating HIV. We're not going to eliminate HIV. At the end of this journey, if we're successful and stop new transmissions, there are still going to be people across Scotland who are living with HIV. We can only do this properly. We can only get to zero properly if we make sure that people who are living with HIV are at the heart of that. That means making sure that they are able to live their lives free from discrimination and stigma, that HIV becomes something that we don't mind talking about, and that when someone tells us that they're living with HIV, it's like them telling us they're living with any other long-term health condition. So we need to make sure that in the work to get to zero, we firstly need to make sure that we are committed to doing it, and that we put the resources behind it to make it happen, but also that we take people who are living with HIV along for the journey and make sure that they recognise that they are a huge part of that journey as well. I think the future is incredibly bright when it comes to HIV in Scotland. I think we look at the progress that's been made and the fact that we have so many people who are now diagnosed and on treatment and are virally suppressed. So they're taking treatment, and it means that they can't pass on HIV, that U equals G message, which is so important. There's a little bit to go, but I feel really optimistic that we can do that, and that we can push to make sure that the people who are out there who are living with HIV and don't know it can get diagnosed, can get onto the treatment, and can enjoy all the benefits that come with that. We've come so far from a position where treatment came around in the mid 1990s, and suddenly people could live with HIV, to the point now where we have a realistic prospect of ending new transmissions, be that through PrEP, be that through continued promotion of condom use, be that through undetectable equals untransmittable. We have all of these tools at our disposal, and that makes me feel really optimistic that we can make that difference. So we've got all of these tools in place. What we need to do now is challenge the stigma that's still there. When it comes to HIV prevention, the kind of starting point for all of it is testing. So if someone is coming forward to us for testing, it's often because something's happened and that seed's been planted in the back of their mind. And once that seed's there, it grows and it grows, and it makes people really anxious, and to the point where they're so anxious that they have to get tested. We want to get to the point where people can access testing more routinely and view it as something that is just part of looking after your sexual health in the same way that you'd look after your physical health, and hopefully people would look after their mental health. The great thing is that once you come forward for testing, once you know your status, it puts you in control. So you can then, if you take a test and it comes back negative, you've got an opportunity then to just get up-to-date information on kind of the different options that are there in terms of prevention, whether that's PrEP or U equals U or using condoms. All those things are there. If the test comes back positive, it means that you can then get access to this life-saving, game-changing treatment that not only helps you live a long, healthy life, but also can reduce the level of HIV in your body to the point where you can't pass it on. So widening access to testing is a really key aspect to this. At the moment, in different parts of the country, in each of the 14 health boards across Scotland, you've got 14 different systems of accessing testing. Some places it's easier to get an appointment than others. The teams in all of these health boards are working incredibly hard, but they're up against it in terms of resources. So we need to make sure that testing is something that is accessible to people, whether that's in a sexual health clinic, whether that is in community settings like the testing that we offer at Waverley Care. If you live in a city, then there's maybe a few more options there. The services are like the big city health boards maybe have slightly more resource for this, and the opportunities for testing are a bit more. They're not ideal, they're not perfect, but there's a lot more there. Once you get out of those city regions and you get to rural areas, it can be a real barrier to accessing testing. You might not want to go and get tested at your local GP because it's someone that's a member of your community who probably knows all your family, and even though doctors take their responsibility for patient confidentiality incredibly seriously, it's still a big deal to open up and ask for that test because you'll see this person in the community. So, but where else do you go then? If you can't go somewhere locally, you're talking maybe a real logistical challenge to access testing somewhere else. So we need to look at options for testing that can make it more accessible to people, whether that is community-based testing in local venues, whether that is postal testing, whether that is making testing available in more settings as a matter of course. So one of the big successes we've seen in terms of testing is every woman who is pregnant, who is going in for care, will be offered blood tests as a routine part of their pregnancy, and that means that any infection gets picked up, they can start on treatment, which means that the chances of transmission of HIV from mother to child are incredibly low. Are there other opportunities? Are there other spaces where we could offer opt-out testing, where we could just say to people, well, you're in here, do you fancy having an HIV test just to check your status? If we normalise those conversations and make it something that isn't something that is special or out of the ordinary, if we normalise it, then it makes it a lot easier and we remove some of the fear around it. So that would be a really good start. It's a really complex thing to kind of unpick, stigma, I suppose. It's one of these things that there are a number of different undercurrents. I think that most stigma, I hope in my heart that most stigma is not meant. I think that a lot of the comments that people will have, a lot of the things that people say that might cause someone living with HIV to feel stigmatized, or a lot of the things that might make people afraid of HIV, they're not said out of malice or a desire to inflict pain on other people. It's just ignorance. It's a lack of knowledge around that stigma. Of course, that it would be great if that was the case for all of it, because then education is the way out of that. There is that aspect of it. There is also, unfortunately, a discriminatory element to stigma. So when people think about HIV, they'll think about the communities that are disproportionately impacted on it, and then their views on HIV then become mixed and coloured by people's perceptions around those communities. So whether that's a degree of racism, if you think it's something that disproportionately affected African communities in Scotland, or whether you think it said something about gay and bisexual men and tying it in with kind of moral judgments about the sex lives of gay and bisexual men, or whether it's whatever it is, it's I suppose tied in with people's discrimination about groups that are disproportionately affected. That's a lot more difficult to kind of to kind of combat that. There is an education aspect to it. It's getting people talking about HIV. It's getting people talking about sexual health, talking about diversity and understanding all of these things, and then people getting these messages out there. We're all a product of our wider communities and our upbringing. If you spend your entire life hearing messages that kind of subtly undermine certain identities or certain groups in society, you're going to grow up feeling that inside. You might not question it as much. It's a long-term project to kind of challenge that. So getting people talking about HIV, getting people talking about sexual health, getting people to the point where they understand HIV can affect anyone, and there are reasons why some communities are disproportionately affected, and that's closely tied with lots of conversations around health inequalities and discrimination that these groups face, and being honest and combating those kind of discriminations where we find them is going to be key to challenging stigma over the long term. I think if you look back to where HIV was in the 80s and 90s, and you think back to some of the headlines and some of the coverage of HIV, there was a real kind of overt discrimination to it. There was a kind of there was an effort to kind of place blame on people and to demonize certain groups. The stigma today has a legacy of that. There's that kind of legacy that people still kind of remember. I think more stigma today is probably through ignorance and the fact that HIV's not in the headlines anymore. It's not something that people talk about a great deal aside from around World AIDS Day. And when it's gone out of people's minds, the thing that has stuck have been these old messages, and they don't necessarily hear the news that we hear when we're working in the sector of all the advances that get made, whether that's with treatment, whether that's with PrEP or whatever. So the stigma has become less overt, I suppose. It's no long as I think it would be quite unusual, I think, to see a headline in the newspaper that was really overtly discriminating against people living with HIV, although I'm sure it will still happen occasionally. But I think when that happens, it will be more outwardly condemned. I think there would be a real outcry with it, which there wouldn't have been in the past. So the stigma today is more subtle, is more hidden. I suppose as well, one of the biggest stigmas we have to tackle today as well is that kind of internalized stigma. So for people who are living with HIV, who for often many, many years of living with HIV have internalized a lot of these messages that they hear around kind of all these judgments about the perceived failings of their character or their actions or blaming of them. When people hear that over and over again, they'll internalize it and they might begin to believe it's true for themselves. So being able to challenge that, being able to give people a space to speak, to feel that they're not going to be judged, to be able to talk about their experience with people who understand is hugely important as well to beginning to heal that stigma. I take a great deal of satisfaction out of the job I do. I think working with people and being there for them and listening to them and giving them the space just to get off their chest whatever they want to get off their chest and to feel safe and able to speak openly is a huge privilege. I'm always grateful to service users who are willing to put their trust in me and open up, and hope that in doing that it gives them some support and makes it easier for them to deal with the challenges that they're maybe facing on a day-to-day basis. In terms of sitting down here and talking, I think it's good to get. I think the most important thing is to get people talking about HIV and get people talking about these issues. First and foremost, I think those voices should be of people who are living with HIV. And for World AIDS Day, it's great that we will hear a lot of voices of people living with HIV. But I think we all have a role to play in educating ourselves and understanding HIV more, showing compassion and understanding, and realizing that at the end of the day, HIV is a manageable long-term health condition. It's something that can affect anybody, and that we all have a responsibility to look after our sexual health, to get tested, and we can all, and in doing so, we can all play our part in getting to zero, including people who are living with HIV. So I suppose working in service delivery, I have the luxury of not having to make those decisions in terms of budget and how you allocate that, and I don't envy people those decisions. I suppose from the point of view of HIV and challenging and reducing new transmissions and providing better support for people living with HIV, the Scottish Government has signed up to ending HIV transmission by 2030. We have a sexual health and bloodborne virus framework, which is around things like tackling stigma, about reducing transmission, about providing support, all of these things that we want to see achieving. We agree on a lot of things. Like, I don't know that there's necessarily a great deal of political opposition to what we want to achieve. The challenge is the political will to make it happen. So we say that these are the targets, this is what we want to do. So the challenge now is to make sure that that is properly funded. It won't happen by itself. It won't happen by goodwill. It won't happen with. It won't happen if it's just. If it's just. It's not going to happen by itself. It needs that kind of investment. You need to realize that if you want to achieve these things, you have to invest in testing. You have to invest in support services. So a commitment's been signed up to, and it's about turning that into reality. In the time that I've worked for Waverley Care, PrEP has become something that has gone from being something that was talked about and could be purchased online to being something that's available on the NHS in Scotland, and we're seeing the impacts of that in terms of when we have conversations with people. Most people we're speaking to now have heard about PrEP. In my service, that's predominantly gay and bisexual men and men who have sex with men. We need to kind of do a bit of work to kind of make sure it's more widely accessible to other communities. That's not to say taking it away from gay and bisexual men. It's about saying we widen access and make it available to as many people as possible. We're seeing the impact of that, though, in terms of reducing numbers of new infections. It's a real kind of, the advent of PrEP was a real a moment that kind of took us a step beyond where we'd been before, where the conversation for decades previous had been about condoms and lube, and practicing safe sex. This was another tool in our arsenal, another option for people, and that's really heartening to see. There's a great deal of work going on at the moment now about how we do widen that access to make it available to other communities that could benefit from it, regardless of gender, regardless of sexuality, regardless of ethnicity, making sure that anyone who could benefit from accessing PrEP can access it. And the evidence that we've seen so far is that PrEP is something that people can engage with, they will engage with, and when they do, new transmissions drop. And that's a real game changer for us. So the more we can roll that out, make people aware of it, the better. At the moment, it's only available in sexual health services, directly through NHS sexual health services. It's a really interesting conversation about whether there are opportunities to make it available in other places. Again, like thinking about maybe communities that are maybe more isolated from central sexual health services, whether that's because they're in a rural area or because they are not near to a big population centre where most services are kind of sited. Is there opportunities for us to make things like PrEP more widely available in settings closer to people?
Right, thank you.
Thank you very much.